You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines as possible. I'm your host, Eileen Farnood, and today I have the pleasure to be joined by Dr. Signy Sheldon, a cognitive neuroscientist and assistant professor in psychology at McGill University in Montreal. Her research mainly focuses on discovering how and why we remember certain events and episodes with behavioral and neuroimaging experiments. She was recognized as a rising star for 2016 by the Association for Psychological Science, won the 2019 CSBBCS Vincent de Lollo Early Career Award, and has been awarded a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in the Cognitive Neuroscience of Memory for 5 years. Thanks so much for joining me today. I was looking into your research a bit before, and I can't wait to get started. So just to jump right into things, could you give a brief introduction of yourself and explain some of your research interests?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Signy Sheldon. I'm an assistant professor at McGill University in the Department of Psychology. So at McGill University, I research the cognitive neuroscience of memory. So specifically, I look at autobiographical memory, which is our past personal recollections. And I try to study how the brain allows us to remember the past in very vivid detail.
Yeah. And right now, what are some of the projects that you're currently working on or have worked on in the past in your lab?
Okay. So one of the aspects of memory that we're really interested in is how we're able to form these rich, detailed representations of past episodes. So your ability to remember a dinner party you went to last summer, or even to remember what you had for dinner yesterday, is a very complex task. And how does the brain allow you to do this? So we look at how one region of the brain, the hippocampus, actually is able to form these mental representations of the past. And one of the projects one of the areas of research that we're really interested in is how these processes let us form representations of the past, but also let us form representations of the future. So the same way you're able to recollect or imagine the past allows you to imagine the future. So the same processes that support remembering the past are also very important in imagining the future. So we study how this can be important for future guided behaviors like planning and problem solving. So that line of work looks at the link between remembering the past, imagining the future, and solving problems. Mm-hmm. So that's one project that we look at. Another project that we look at is individual differences in the ability to remember the past. So I'm sure this is something that you've experienced when you talk to people and you are talking about an event that you both went to. You'll notice that your friend will remember that event very differently than how you remember it. So some people will remember their past by imagining a lot of details. So they'll be able to remember what things looked like, who was there, and what they saw. Well, another person might remember the same event, but remember it more by how they felt, what that memory meant, and what actually happened. So in our lab, what we look at is to see if these individual differences in how people construct the past, if we can find those differences in the brain. And we do neuroimaging work, so we use brain imaging technology. And also we use behavioral studies to try to uncover these brain mechanisms that underlie individual differences in remembering. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the other aspects of work that we focus on that is very relevant to today's time is the impact of stress on memory. So we have done a lot of studies in the lab looking at how psychological stress can impact your ability to recollect the past. And it also actually impacts how you encode or you create memory traces.
Yeah, and you were just mentioning that you use like fMRI and like behavioral studies to conduct your research. So I was wondering just in general, what are some of the like tools and methods that you use for experimentation? And are there certain methods which you found to be like, more reliable than others?
That's a really, really good question. So when you're studying memory, and especially when you're studying humans, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this research, and because of that, there's a lot of different tools. I think that the use of the tools will depend on what questions you have. Now, for me and a lot of members of my lab, we're really interested in how the brain supports memory. And because of that, we tend to use tools that let us look at brain activity as people are remembering events. And so we've turned to fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. This is a technology in which you can actually look at how the brain is functioning as people are performing a cognitive task. And that's really important because it allows us to see the importance of certain brain regions for particular functions. Now, the problem with neuroimaging technologies like fMRI is that it's correlational. So we can't infer causality, a direct link between this brain activity and the function that people are performing. For us to actually know that a certain brain structure is critical for a task, we have to look at this in patients who have brain lesions. So in my lab, we also do study people with lesions to particular areas of the brain that are important for memory. This is the hippocampus, to see how their memory is impaired, and then how other cognitive functions are impaired. So we've looked at people with hippocampal lesions who we know have deficits in recollecting the past. And what we found is that they are also impaired at imagining the future. And they're also impaired when you ask them to try to solve problems. So when you try to get them to solve a simple real world problem, like what would you do if your car broke down and you had to get to work? They wouldn't be able to solve that problem with the detail and efficiency that somebody who doesn't have memory impairment does. So that's another way that we try to understand how the brain supports memory and how these memory processes are very important for other functions in our daily life.
Mm-hmm. And also, I was looking at your lab website earlier, and I saw that you sort of categorize your research into like three main streams regarding like how we remember the past, why we remember the past, and what affects the way we remember the past.
Yeah.
So I think you've alluded a little bit to the first question, but I was wondering so far if through your research you've been able to formulate hypotheses to any of these like really big questions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So when I started my research lab at McGill, those were the three burning questions, and they still are the three burning questions. I mean, they're pretty large. How do we remember? Why do we remember? And what causes us to remember differently? And by studying all these different streams of research, we really have come up with a theoretical model in my lab about the forms and functions of autobiographical remembering. So in essence, we have come up with this model that this brain region, the hippocampus, which is really important in how you construct memories. So how you construct memories is going to depend on how your hippocampus forms a representation of the past at retrieval. And what's really wild is that the hippocampus actually constructs memory representations as you retrieve them. So that means that when you are retrieving an event, you can retrieve a memory very differently each time you retrieve it. So memory retrieval is very dynamic in that way. And that's how we retrieve it. So why we're able to do that is because the hippocampus, in its ability to flexibly recall the past. So it can recall some, but not all details of the past, can actually combine memories together to form mental simulations of not yet experienced events. So that's why we're able to recall memories flexibly. And that's why we might have memory distortions. It's actually because we do want to distort memories in some way to create novel simulations that are going to help us plan and predict for the future. So the way memory works is actually so that we can predict our futures. And with that understanding of how memory works and why memory works, we can then look at what factors affect it. So we know that aging affects memory. So aging makes it more difficult to remember specific events from the past. And now we know that it actually also makes it very hard to imagine specific futures. So aging affects memory in that way. Depression is another thing that we have been looking at in how it affects memory. So people who have depression actually remember their past a little bit more negatively, and they remember it more generally. So they're not really able to remember specific details from the past. And that actually carries forward into how they imagine their future.
Mm. So you were talking about how how you remember the past correlated directly to how you can sort of imagine what might happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how accurate our predictions are just generally for what might happen? Because I know at least just in general, it might seem to an average person that you might not be super, I don't know, knowledgeable as to what might happen next. So it was really interesting that you're saying this is the reason why we remember everything in the first place.
I think that's a really good point. How accurate are we able to predict our future? So that's the question you're asking.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of what's really important is to consider is that is going to depend a lot on the person who's doing the predicting.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because so many things can affect the way you use these memory processes. So if something's going to affect how you remember the past, and we know the past isn't remembered very accurately, those same things are going to affect how you remember the future, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So I'm not sure we can really comment on how accurate somebody's imagination of the future is, just as it's very difficult to comment on, the accuracy of past memories in some ways. So memories really aren't literal records of the past. They really are online sort of creative expressions of the past. And that is exactly what I think these future imaginations are.
Mm-hmm.
I think these future imaginations that we're able to create because of how memory works are really good for us to try to have these long-term plans, right? So they might not be so useful if we had to, try to imagine something like making coffee, which is something that you do very routine. But if you wanted to try to imagine what your vacation is going to be like next summer, being able to imagine multiple outcomes and imagine what could happen in specific detail can be something that's going to be really useful in moving you towards that goal.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the ability to imagine these future events and these future outcomes they're really useful also for motivating people to keep moving towards them.
Just shifting the conversation to sort of what's been going on right now in the world. I was wondering, given our current situation with COVID-19, how has your research been affected? And I know you're talking about these sorts of behavioral studies that you were doing prior, I assume, and you probably can't conduct those studies anymore. So I was wondering, how are you going about conducting research now, and how's all this confusion been affecting?
It's definitely been difficult. It's been difficult for everyone. What we have been doing is we've been doing more studies online. So we've been shifting our research to online platforms to collect data. Now we can't obviously collect neuroimaging data online, But what we're doing is we're doing a lot of collecting large samples of data from people from across the world, where we ask them to try to remember past memories and also to imagine future memories. And then what we're doing is we're going to see if there's a correlation in the ability for people to remember the past and imagine the future. We're going to look at the ability to do that in relation to stress. We're going to look at this in relation particularly to the stress that people feel in response to the global pandemic. And what we predict is going to happen is that if somebody does experience a lot of stress right now, it's going to be more difficult for them to come up with specific past memories and also to imagine any future in any sort of detail. And that's because we know that stress really does affect the ability to do that. Another layer that we're looking at in this research is the impact of emotion. So we know that with stress and with anxiety, there tends to be a focus towards negative outcomes. So what we think might happen there is that we might see a bias towards remembering negative future events if you feel very stressed out about your current situation at the moment. So that's the sort of research that we've shifted to focus on because of the current times. And I think it's really important to not only shift how you do research in response to the way the world is currently, but you also have to shift what you're researching. And I say that because if this summer, with a pandemic and with a lot of other issues happening in the world, if we just kept going forward studying memory as memory, not capturing all the other situations that people are in right now, we might not be capturing memory as just memory in that sense, because the world we are in really does affect our cognitive processes. So that's something that we always have to consider when we're doing research with humans.
Mm-hmm. And also, just out of curiosity, with all of these behavioral, or at least studies where you receive input from like various participants, do you ever have trouble like finding people to do the studies themselves? Or also, you were mentioning before that sometimes you were looking for specific people who had like memory lesions.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good point. So, with human research and memory, you can't go and just make your own lesions in the brain to get participants. So, with that, it's difficult to find the patients that we want to study. Usually we don't have trouble finding people to participate in our studies. But what we always have to consider is the complexity of people. So unlike rat research, if people are studying memories within rats, there's a lot of control that you can have there. These rats live in the same box. They're bred the same way, they eat the same food. But the participants that we have in our study, they come with very different life experiences, which affect memory processes, and it also affects what memories people can remember. So with that said, we don't often have trouble finding people to participate in our study, but what we do have maybe not trouble with, but something that we always have to consider is the complexity and the diversity of our sample. And that is something that is really, really important. It helps us understand what affects memory more, but it also means that we have to test many more people so that we can see what is common among people's memory functioning over and above these differences that we're interested in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. Just like shifting it back to what you do, I was wondering sort of what led you to become a professor in psychology.
Okay, that's a very good question. So it's funny, I don't think I ever set out to be a professor in psychology. So when I was in high school, or even when I was in undergraduate, doing my undergraduate degree in university, being a professor was not my end goal, but I just really loved to learn. And I really loved to learn about how people think and how the brain works? These were questions that just I kept thinking about, late at night. Not every night, but I kept thinking about, how does the brain work? Why do we think the way we do? Why is it that I remember that party so much differently than my sister or my brother? How can people have these false memories? Why does memory decline in age? These were just questions that kept coming up, and I was annoyed that there was no solid answers for them. So I just kept doing things to try to feed that curiosity. So I took more classes on psychology and neuroscience in undergrad. And then after that, I thought, I want to keep learning more. So I went to grad school and in Toronto at U of T. And, with that, I just saw that academia and being a professor is such a great way to keep learning and keep discovering. So I think that is just what kept me going. And what kept me going is that these questions never have answers. And while that's really annoying, it's really beautiful, because we always have something new to discover and understand about how the brain works, how memory works. And I guess that's how I ended up where I ended up.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, one last major question before we wrap things up. But I always like to ask sort of a question related to the implications of the type of research that you're doing. So specifically, since your research is focused on memory, I was wondering, in the context of society as a whole, why is it important to understand memory, and what influence might this field have on either other research or real world applications? It's a really big question, but yeah.
No, I think that's very important, because research is really important for discovery purposes, but we do want to make sure that the research we're doing can have implications for society. And memory research is so important for so many different aspects of society. So I'm going to give you 3 areas in which memory research is very important. The first is the courtroom. So in the courtroom, in the legal process, eyewitness testimonies are used quite often. Eyewitness testimonies is essentially relying on human autobiographical memory. And if we know that autobiographical memory, how humans recollect episodes from their life, can be distorted, can be changed and malleable, it's subject to suggestion, it's very important to understand that. It's very important to understand how memories can be distorted, is if that is going to have implications for how those eyewitness testimonies are used. The second is disease and aging. So aging, as I said, is associated with declines in your ability to remember specific episodes from your life. This also means, now from understanding the link between past remembering and future imagination, that maybe older adults are going to have troubles with planning and predicting for their futures. So that's something that's really important for us to understand. How does memory change as we get older? And what can we do to help develop therapies or interventions to alleviate those changes? So that's just healthy aging, but there's also these conditions like dementia, so Alzheimer's disease, that are characterized with deficits to memory. So the research that I'm doing, a lot of it focuses on aging, because we really want to understand how aging and also these pathological conditions associated with aging affect memory. If we understand that link, then maybe we're going to be able to figure out who might be susceptible to Alzheimer's disease before it happens, and then we can intervene earlier. And then finally, the third area in which memory is really, really important, and our understanding of memory is really important, is something that you're doing right now, is in the education system. So when you learn, you have to remember things. So if we can better understand how people remember, the factors that are going to affect your ability to remember, we can use those to help people learn in a more effective manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. I actually never gave thought to specifically court cases and how memory might play a role there, but that's really interesting. But yeah, well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to have this conversation with me. I learned a lot. And before we end things off completely, if any of our listeners have any sorts of questions or comments that they would like to make, and how would they be able to get in contact with you?
So if anybody has any questions and they'd like to get in contact, they can go to my lab's webpage, which is it's Sheldon Memory Lab at McGill.com. And in there, there's a little tab in which it says contact us, and then you can write a message in there and I'll respond to that.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks so much.